Cameron Schwab, welcome. You spent 25 years as a CEO of multiple AFL clubs.
Multiple sounds like a lot, doesn't it? Yeah, three AFL clubs, yeah.
And was first appointed at Richmond at age 24. What did the first 6 years of your life out of high school look like?
It was straight from school into football, actually. It was during my final year of school, I applied for a job in the paper, which was as a cadet administrator at the Melbourne Football Club, and applied for that role. And I had a strong family background in the sport, and I got no doubt the fact that my surname was Schwab was probably the reason why I got the role. I didn't have any other particular claims for it, other than probably someone who'd grown up very much in the game, and so therefore when that type of role came up, I think I was probably able to offer at least a family insight, if nothing else. So I went straight from school. That was never the plan, but worked straight away, so I didn't actually do the post-school uni thing. And then I spent the next 6 years at the Melbourne Football Club. It merged into a recruiting role, and then after that, in that 6-year period, I was in CEO of Richmond Footy Club, so 6 years after leaving school. Yeah.
Did you ever find the social pressures of being a young adult conflicting with your career ambitions?
Yeah, particularly then, I think, because I was expected, I was living in an adult world probably as a young person, and I wasn't someone who was any sort of prodigy or anything like that. I was actually quite young physically as well, so I always looked young, and I always joke with people, I don't reckon I reached puberty until I was about 23 or 24, so it was actually, even physically looking young was a bit of a challenge, particularly when the roles I was taking started to emerge more into leadership roles, and then the leadership roles, there's a different expectation on your maturity at that time. And I was recruiting players full time at about age 20 or 21, so that was probably the time when I realised that there was a higher expectation of me in terms of the maturity I showed, and so therefore, this one of the sacrifices perhaps I had to make was, being less social and less time just to be a young person in some ways, and but that was probably at that time the price I was prepared to pay.
What approach did you take to work every day so that by the time you're 24 years old, you're the best candidate to become CEO of Richmond?
I'm not sure. Best candidate, that's an interesting concept. I don't think I've ever been asked whether I was a candidate. It was put to me to be the CEO. It was called the General Manager then, so I was General Manager of Richmond. And it came about through a fellow by the name of Paddy Ganane, who was a very well-known Richmond person at that time, and is a life member of the club and a premiership player. I was at a game as a recruiter, and I was watching it, and Paddy wandered over and asked me whether I'd be interested in working for the Tigers, and I thought it was in recruiting, because I was just building a little bit of a reputation at that time as being okay at that role. And then he mentioned to be the general manager. In many ways, I was surprised, but I was probably just getting my head around the fact that might be an opportunity for me at some time in the future. So I think probably as much as anything, I'd done my 10,000 hours in the sport. I'd grown up in the game. I was in recruiting, which by its very nature meant you had to watch a lot of the game. So probably within the game itself, I was okay. What I wasn't prepared for was what it meant to actually be the leader and be the CEO. I could only make that up as I went and just learn from the experiences of actually doing it. And I always had, I think I was fortunate that I had very supportive parents growing up who always talked of self-belief, and probably always presented myself as someone who had strong self-belief, but in many ways I was just working it out.
What kind of people did you reach out to, or extra experiences you seek to fill any gaps in your skill set?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because there were gaps everywhere, and again I was fortunate. My father was someone who was a very prominent person in the sport, and had a strong Richmond heritage as well, so I was able to reach out to him. He died a couple of years later though, so that left a bit of a void at that time, and I was then very fortunate that a fellow by the name of Alan Jeans, who was a great coach, coached Richmond for a very short period of time, and in many ways the conversations that I was having with my dad, which I could no longer have, were filled by Alan, and I was also very lucky that when I went to the Melbourne Football Club, Ron Barassi was the senior coach, so to actually go from growing up with Tom Hafey as a legendary figure in the sport, with my father at Richmond, through to Ron Barassi as the first coach at the Melbourne Football Club, and then had the opportunity working with Alan Jeans, there was no lack of really good, strong role models around me. Probably because of the way I'd grown up, I'd worked out that these guys were actually quite accessible as well. They weren't people to be just admired, they were people to be talked to, and they were people to be learned from. And I always felt comfortable in asking questions, and even talking about times in their lives where perhaps they'd struggled or they'd failed. And often coaches will talk about that, and your wisdom often comes from your failures. So to have some people around like that was a real privilege.
Would you say your father was the greatest influence on your professional career?
Yeah, no, very much. My mum as well. My mum's a very strong figure in our family, and because my father he had a big job, mum did most of the bringing up of the kids, and mum had her first child at 16 years of age. So she had 3 kids by the time by her early 20s, and with pretty much full responsibility for our upbringing and in suburban Melbourne, and so she's a very strong figure in my life as well, as was her father. Who I've got a strong background in art as well as in the sport, and probably the artistic aspect came from the mum side of the family, and the sports side or the football side from my dad. So both my parents were really strong figures, and I'm still very close to my brother and sister. So people who my family would undoubtedly have had the biggest influence.
Can you pinpoint the major learnings that you were able to take away from your mother and your father?
From mum, it was go deep into your values, understand who you want to be, and I think there's a momentum often in our careers, and you guys are going through it now, that you go from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, whereas mum was always very much about there are certain things you've got to absolutely believe in, which will then become the context for future decisions that you get to make, and my mum was very strong on that, and in some ways it was very strong social values. I think came from that. I often get asked about that, and that definitely came from my mum. In terms of dad, it was to always be yourself, or always have confidence. Don't try and be someone else. Fine, within your own experiences and with your own personality, there'll be the thing that you can then leverage to be a leader or be the person you actually want to be. And that was probably, from a parenting point of view, they're 2 really powerful role models to actually have. And both had their own challenges as parents and as adults, which we all lived through together. But we came out of it with a really strong family.
You talk about leadership as something to be rather than something to do. Can you share some examples of what that looked like in your life as a 21-year-old?
As a 21-year-old, that's an interesting question. Well, I think that it comes back to that conversation before about it's not, if you're not prepared to go deep before you go forward as a leader, you're going to represent yourself as a leader being someone other than who you are. And it's going to have 2 effects or 2 impacts. The first one is you're going to get exhausted because you can't keep pretending. You can't try and be something that you're not. And the second part of it is that you're going to actually lose confidence as well, because your confidence is built on your capability in the main, and you might as well leverage stuff that you're good at rather than try and pretend that you're good at something that you're not. And so the B thing was very much about, people like the idea of doing leadership, as in the opportunities that actually come with it, but to actually be it means that you've got to be pretty sure of what you stand for as a human being. And I think most people will work with just about anyone as their leader as long as they know what they're getting, and then they can make their own choice as to what they're getting is either for them or not for them. But if they're not sure what they're going to get each day when they turn up to work, I think you're dishonouring them as a leader within their organisation. So the B thing comes very much down to the need to honour the people who you work with and for, and also to be true to yourself.
How has the working landscape of the AFL industry changed over your time, and why should students aspire to work in it today?
Yeah, it probably, when you're working in something for as long as I did, sometimes you're less aware of the changes because you're part of them. It's I saw it evolve and emerge when I used to go to Richmond Footy Club with my dad. When I was a kid, when he was secretary of the club, he was the only full-time person working there. And when I left the game, we had half staff of well over 100 people, including, if you include your players who are now full-time, probably close to 200 people full-time or full-time equivalents. So obviously that's one of the reasons it's changed. Generally, the changes in the sport have represented whatever changes are happening in the world. The game's become far more, there's much higher expectations of the sport than what there was during when I first started, particularly at a social level. That makes it unbelievably attractive in that you get to lead often in a way which is driving social change. I think we've seen that with women's football, for example. That's not only is a great thing that women are being recognised as athletes in the sport, but in many ways it's also leading a social discourse in lots of ways as well. We saw it when the game got serious about racism and these sorts of things as well. So I see that as the great opportunity in the sport. If it's just about doing something which is about the commerciality of the game, about branding, about social media, about those things, those things exist within the game, but they probably don't vary as much between what you're doing within the sport as to other businesses as well, except for the fact that obviously a lot more people have an interest in it. But in terms of your day-to-day existence, it doesn't change dramatically. The real excitement and the real enjoyment in the game is actually being part of the true culture of the game in many ways, and that's at the performance level, or that's at the community social level. And that's the things I always found attractive. The rest of it's a really good experience to have, but it's not necessarily going to be the thing you do for the rest of your life.
The AFL is a very attractive industry to many, many people. Is there anything you think those people should be cautious of before they pursue a career in it?
So if you turn your hobby into your everyday, well, you're going to have to find yourself another hobby somewhere. You're going to have to find something else which becomes your escape. For a lot of people, the game is their escapism. Once you're working in it full time, it stops being that. You become. Someone asks you a question at a dinner party about what you actually do. Well, you're not just answering on behalf of your own opinion. You're answering on behalf of the organisation you're now working for as well. So you've got to be careful about what you say. So there are elements of all of that which need to be taken into account. Now that's a very exciting thing as well, because that gives you the chance to really be immersed in something that you actually do. But that comes at a little bit of a cost. So I'd always say to people that if people say they love the game and they'd love to work in the game, I then test how deep their love of the game is. How often they watch it. What's the narrative of their own life? Do they pick up the paper and flip it straight over to the back page to see what's going on? Do they sit up and watch all the footy shows at night? Do they all the stuff which you can be engaged in the sport doing are normally the test of how much people really love it. Because if you're going to work in it and you want to make it your career, that's the level you have to take it.
And finally, if you're on the board of an AFL club today, would you appoint a 24-year-old CEO?
No, I wouldn't. And in hindsight, there was probably times where Richmond were wondering why they hired me. I probably presented as a 24-year-old CEO a lot of the time. Both in terms of my capability and also just pure experience. But I wouldn't be concerned about giving a young person the role. My background was a little bit unique in that I'd grown up with the game, I'd gone straight from school into the game, but I'd only worked 6 years of my whole life. Before that, my only other job was a paper round. So it wasn't the type of background which would suggest that you should be in charge of that type of organisation. But once you get into once you've got 10 years or so wrapped up, I wouldn't have any hesitation if the person's shown the right learner mindset and they're showing the right sort of capability and enthusiasm for the role.
Fantastic.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Good on you.
Thanks, Aaron.
Take care.